Okay, we'll continue with part 12 of Federalist number 15. Like I said in the previous video, I have a list of things that one needs to be familiar with if one wants to think of good governance. What makes a good government? And in the new Constitution that Americans wrote in Philadelphia, these ideas had to be paid attention to. They had to be institutionalized in the Constitution so that government works well and worked best for everybody concerned, for all the 13 states. And we talked about the division of powers in the last video. I said, because governors were royal governors before the American Revolution, they were appointed by the king, and they would always look for what was best for the king. Right after the American Revolution, the states wrote new constitutions, and they decided that states either did not need governors, or if they did, governors would have no powers. And all the powers, or most of the powers, would be in the hands of the legislatures. So there were no division of powers that you can really call division of powers. There were pretty much no checks and balances because the legislature was dominant. For example, right now, in the Constitution of the United States, the president, who is a governor in a sense, nominates somebody as Secretary of State. But that Secretary of State has to be confirmed by the Senate. It's where this division of powers and checks and balances comes into picture. But during the American Revolution, after the states wrote their new constitutions, in all of the states, the governors had nothing to do with appointments. The legislatures were totally in control. So again, it's an example of lack of division of powers, lack of checks and balances. And those were some of the mistakes that led to the writing of this new Constitution, because the new Constitution wanted to keep these frameworks in place, wanted to make sure that these ideas are respected, because without them, you really could not have a working government, a working, balanced government that would not be one day fall under control of a demagogue, a dictator, a tyrant, or even, let's say, a group of men that control one part of the legislature and they happen to be bad people. Then the other parts can check the bad group, can make sure that they do not abuse power. So that's where these ideas come from. Because right now we see all over the world, somebody comes into power and the legislature, or most of the legislature, becomes their tools rather than being a part of government that will check and balance that person in power. Let's say this president or prime minister. They will just be their tools, and they will cooperate with that president, and that president abuses power, and the country suffers as a result of it. or if the judiciary, if the judges rule against the person that's in power and it's abusing power, then they'll fire the judges, or they'll take away their salaries, or they'll do something that the judge is no longer independent, because they want a dependent judiciary that is dependent, that the judges are dependent for their money, for their income, for their salary, and for the terms that they serve. They're all dependent on either the legislature or the president or the prime minister. So they side with the person in power when they're dependent. So you don't want a dependent judiciary, you want an independent judiciary. Okay, I will continue. Short paragraph starts with, but if we are unwilling to be placed in this perilous situation, if we still will adhere to the design of a national government, or which is the same thing, of a superintending power under the direction of a common council, we must resolve to incorporate into our plan those ingredients which may be considered as forming the characteristic difference between a league and a government. We must extend the authority of the Union to the persons of the citizens, the only proper object of government. Aha, this is the part that he says and refers to something that is very important. From the last paragraph, we learned that a league of friendship, or pretty much a confederation based on treaties, is not going to be good for anybody. It says the states that are in these treaties, they can tear up the treaty at any time, that their passions and interests take over and say, we're out, we no longer respect this treaty. But here he says, we want to have a union that is truly a union, that is good for the long-term interest of yours. And to have a union like that, the federal union, the national government, the central government, has to be able to apply its laws to every citizen in every state, and not have to go beg the state governments to do what the national government has to do. For a government to work, it has to be able to ask every citizen, regardless of where they live, to follow the law. So if a person here in North Carolina broke the federal law, the federal government does not have to go ask the state of North Carolina, the legislature of North Carolina, to punish this person. For a government to work, the federal government has to go find that person and bring that person to justice. So this last line that says this is the only proper objects of government, which means we must extend the authority of the Union to the persons of citizens. Because up to now, he said, under the Confederation, all we could do was to come and ask the state legislature and state government to do certain things for us. But he says that's not going to work. If somebody in Pennsylvania breaks the federal law, the federal government has to be able to hold them accountable. They have to either take him to court or to do whatever that's needed to be done to bring that person to justice. So that is his core argument. One of the reasons he's saying this is because, remember, we discussed this before. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress, would have to make requisitions to the states for money as well as for militias and soldiers. And it was up to the state governments to comply. To say, okay, we will, or to send half the money that was required of them, no money at all. But in this new constitution that we are talking about, it says federal government has to be able to tax the citizens wherever they are directly. And he says, well, if we are taxing the citizens directly, if we have that power, then we have to be able to hold the person accountable if that person doesn't pay the tax we want when we need it. We don't have to come to the states and beg the states to go find this person and bring him or her to justice. He says, we have to be able to do it. If we want to call ourselves a government, a federal government, a government of the union, we have to hold people to account. So that's where the difference is. That's where the core argument of this Federalist is to apply the laws to the citizens of the union directly and not to have asked permission from the states to apply the law.